and local news reporting is being replaced by Facebook groups, by community groups, by citizen journalists. And some of those are great, and some of them are not so good. Some of them give a balanced view of important things, some don't. Some give a very biased view, and that hollowing out of local journalism it can be the real detriment to local democracy.
Welcome to Political Sandbox by Chamber UK for today's special episode for UN World Press Freedom Day. My name's Owen Meredith. I'm the Chief Exec of the News Media Association, which is a representative organisation for local, regional and national press in the UK. My background, I've worked in media policy for a number of years. And I'm delighted to be joined by Damian today, who is the MP for Folkestone and Hythe and Vice Chair of the Digital Regulation and Responsibility All-Party Group. Today, we're talking about World Press Freedom Day, anniversary of you, and it feels right that we should start with the vital role that the media is playing in reporting on Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. We've seen, I think, some really powerful journalism from both broadcast photography and press over the last 12 months or so of that war. Damian, what are your reflections? What have you seen that has caught your attention in that reporting?
It is extraordinary, the work that journalists have done in bringing the world the truth of what is happening right in the front line, right in the heart of the action. It shows you not just the dedication journalists have to do that, the huge risk to their own lives that they're taking, the loss of life of journalists because they are wanting to be right in the action, right in the front line itself. And without their efforts, then the news from Ukraine would be controlled by state actors, would be controlled by the Russian media, the massive disinformation they've tried to put out about the nature of the conflict. People living within Russia itself, will struggle to see any real news about the war in Ukraine through official news channels. So it is the work of the journalists in the front line that is telling the stories of what is happening in that country on a daily basis, and it has never been more vital.
And just on that point around sort of state actors or kind of others, clearly we've seen a very different type of reporting of the war from a Russian perspective. And it strikes me, I was speaking to a colleague who's got sort of Russian connections, and they were talking about family members that just kind of have a completely different perspective on what is actually happening because of the way that Russian and unfree media in Russia is reporting on this.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's an offence in Russia even to suggest there is a war there. Let alone that Russia is an aggressor in that war. And it just shows you that if where a state has control of the media and control of the message, shape the way that people and make it very hard, for people to have access to news and information. And whilst people are being encouraged to use virtual private networks to get around state censorship of the internet, get access to Western media. But that is still going to be hard for some people, but also others, some will be disinclined to do it. So, Russia seeks to influence not just by controlling the state media, but by blocking access to other forms of news and information as well.
Absolutely. And turning to your work in Parliament and things that are happening at the moment, clearly we've recently seen the introduction of the Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Bill, which is a mighty bill at 388 pages that will help to, we hope, certainly from News Media Association perspective, rebalance the power between big tech platforms and media in a digital age. Clearly, that will hopefully help bring financial sustainability to the media. And without financial sustainability, there is no point in having a free press. So how do you see that bill working, and kind of what do you envisage in terms of the parliamentary process? Are we going to get this bill passed quickly?
Well, I mean, in terms of the parliamentary process, yeah, absolutely. It's important that we do get it done quickly. I think it'll be done, I think, in the next year. I don't think it'll probably won't be completed in this session, which will end in the autumn, but will carry over into, I would imagine, the next session. But hopefully within this in the next 12 months, it will be in law. And it's very important. This is a piece of legislation the government has brought forward. The new government, when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, decided to bring the bill forward, and it gives teeth to the digital markets unit at the Competition and Markets Authority, and will give competition similar to what we're seeing emerging in the European Union with their Digital Markets Act, and just give people a sense of why it's important and what it will do. Really, it recognises that many of the major digital platforms are the principal way through which people access markets to buy and sell things, and they um, and also those digital places are also offering services themselves as well. So if you are an app developer and maybe you make games on for app-based games, you can't really have a business unless you can distribute those games through app stores or on major platforms like say Facebook. If you're selling a physical product, even if you're selling if your publisher selling books, you can't avoid using platforms like Amazon in order to distribute your. We've seen with services like mapping is a good example, how that's become dominated by Google products, where there used to be lots of independent businesses that operated in that space. So the question of the Digital Markets Act is, where businesses are controlling marketplaces, do they do so fairly? Do they abuse that market power to favor their own services above other people's, and to consolidate their power within the market? And so we have to think about not just do Google and Amazon compete against each other? Does Meta compete with them? Does Apple compete with them? But actually, do these businesses have areas of digital markets which they control? I think app stores is one of the best demonstrations of this, because there are only two mobile phone operating systems, Android and iOS. They both have app stores, and those app stores really work as kind of monopolies, which those businesses control. So for publishers, again, if you look at any of the Ofcom data, if you look at Ofcom Media Nation's annual report, what you see very strikingly there is the way that social media has become it's not just the shift of news being from a printed form, if you're a newspaper, into a digital form. It's people aren't even going to a lot of people aren't even going to newspaper websites, to access news digitally there. That is getting it in bite-sized chunks distributed through social media. Now that throws up two problems. One is about access to news and information. How are people finding out about stories if they're largely being recommended by a social media platform? On what basis does that platform decide to recommend content? Do you only see what you share? Do you only, on the whole, see things that reflect the audiences you're already part of? So there's that question about editorial control, and how do people find out about important things they might not know they need to know about, but nevertheless do. And the other thing is about compensation, because if you're a publisher and your content is being consumed not in a space that you curate, not in a space that you're necessarily selling advertising against, and it's being distributed for free, then what do you get back? And I think this is very important for the news industry, that we allow proper compensation between the major platforms that distribute effectively news content for free. So if you're a social media platform like Twitter or Facebook, and you're distributing news content, or you're letting your users distribute it for free, you're keeping all the data about that content, you're selling the advertising against that content. What's in it for the news publishers? And if news publisher content is just given away, then you're not going to have a business. And what we've seen around the world is, actually, I think, I know, and I'm sure I've got your own insights on this, but I think what we tend to see is some of the major news companies over the years have made a pretty good fist of becoming digital companies. So we've done it through a combination of subscription, or creating a very big audience and a very big ad platform. But they found a way to make money out of it. Some haven't, and some have diminished. A lot of stations have closed altogether. In America, I think it's worse, but we see this in this country, where local journalism, local news has really been hollowed out. The number of journalists being employed at a constituency level is far fewer than it was when I became Member of Parliament 13 years ago. And local news reporting is being replaced by Facebook groups, by community groups, by citizen journalists. And some of those are great, and some of them are not so good. Some of them give a balanced view of important things, some don't. Some give a very biased view, and that hollowing out of local journalism it can be the real detriment to local democracy. And therefore, what the Digital Markets Bill needs to do is create fair markets online for consumer benefit, but for the news industry, give it a chance to compete, give it a chance to get fair compensation for its products, and the information it provides, and with that, give it a chance to hire more journalists, keep its important services going.
I think you touched on there the sort of what happens when you don't have a sort of sustainable and free press in operation, and the kind of the groups that often well-intentioned come in to fill that space with Facebook groups and things, but don't have those same editorial controls and checks that professional media organizations have in place. And I guess with the sort of mass proliferation of content that's available, and presumably even more so as AI gets going and kind of generative AI starts to produce content in vast volumes, kind of cutting through that mis and disinformation online is going to be a real challenge, and kind of, I guess, feeding into that the sort of media literacy and people understanding what information that they're being presented online means, and which is genuine journalism and which is somebody's opinion or something else.
That's right. And often it'd be very difficult because they're set up to look like real news sites, sometimes an actual rip-off of a real news site. And therefore, if people can't tell the difference, they may not know. And we've seen through studies of Facebook, it was a very good investigation done by some New York Times journalists looking at Facebook during the last US presidential election, which actually showed that it's when you allow trusted news sources to reach their audiences properly, it's a very good way of controlling disinformation, of actually making sure people are getting the real news. And when you allow those trusted news sources to be drowned out by what Facebook calls civic groups, those are the places where the disinformation tends to thrive, and it just crowds people out, crowds out the legitimate journalism. When you talk to, and I think on World Press Freedom Day, a great person to mention is Maria Ressa, one of the two journalists that won the Nobel Peace Prize last year. And her news organization Rappler in the Philippines, it struggles to fight against a government regime that seeks to drown out journalism. Seems to bury it under a weight of fake news, and allows social media spaces to become dominated by fake news. So real news is very hard to find, and that has, of course, it's in those dark spaces that democracy dies.
No, absolutely. And you kind of almost naturally leading us on to my next question, which is about the sort of other side of the financials in the online world is the sort of regulation and safety. And the online safety bill is thankfully now in its hopefully final iteration and making its way through final stages in the Lords and then ping pong. How do you see that bill working? You've clearly worked very closely from the draft bill and chairing that pre-legislative scrutiny committee. How do you see that bill working in practice?
Yeah, well, I feel I see that bill from lots of different angles. Now, sort of back as a parliamentarian, looking at it as it progresses. I mean, my hope is the Lords will complete their processes in the next month or two, and by summer recess, we should have approved the legislation, and then Ofcom can get on with the job of creating the codes of practice and doing the risk assessments of the platforms. I think what's been a very long process of this bill. I mean, it's really 3 or 4 years from like white paper through to draft bill scrutiny and then legislating. What sort of happened to the bill in that period of time. I think we're in a position where we may not be the first place in the world to legislate for this now, but I think we could have the most comprehensive legislation. And what's happened as the bill has gone through its various iterations and been amended as it's gone through Parliament, is I think to make it much more specific in a way, to make it much clearer what it is we're trying to regulate. One of the challenges has always been, well, how can you regulate for harm? Some person's view on what is harmful could be different from someone else's. So what you've got to try and do is to say that where we've got behaviour that is illegal, that we understand what those legal thresholds are, be that for serious crimes like child abuse or the promotion of terrorism, but also crimes like harassment, crimes like like race hate, where we've got clear definitions, is that we can say to tech platforms, you should be moderating your platforms at least to the standard where the law says that an offence is being committed. You should be proactively monitoring your platforms for that sort of illegal activity and behaviour. And the other thing you need to do is, if you've got terms of service where you promise to customers that, for example, they won't see hate speech, well, how do you define what that is? I thought it was very interesting with the BBC. He challenged the journalist to say, well, how do what do you think hate speech is? How much are you seeing? Well, actually, I think the question back for Elon Musk is, well, if your platform says it doesn't allow hate speech, what do you define that as being? What enforcement do you take about it against it, and do you do that consistently? And at the moment, we've no real way of knowing. And it actually, this comes back to journalism. One of the roles that journalism has played in the whole story of online safety has been exposing what's going on at platforms. Exposing content they don't remove, exposing internal research that shows that they understand the problem but they don't always act on it, and exposing that fact. Well, with the online safety bill, I mean, we'll still, I'm sure, rely on journalists to do some of that great work for us, but we'll have a regulator that's empowered to know, empowered to investigate as well, and also with the power to take action against platforms if they fail in their safety duties.
And within the bill, there are protections specifically for journalistic content and content news publishers, which I think you were probably quite instrumental in ensuring were in there. Clearly, as part of that sort of countering of misinformation and ensuring that people do have access to genuine sources of information, why did you sort of make it part of your mission to make sure that those protections were there?
So I think this is a really important point, because one of the issues with content on social media platforms is you don't always know who's doing it. So there's two levels of responsibility. There's the responsibility of the platform, which is distributing this information and often promoting it to other users. There's the question then about, well, who is the actual ultimate source of that journalism, or that comment, or that content, whatever it is. Now, in the news industry, editors are responsible. Editors are responsible not just for the journalism, but even the advertising that they accept to run alongside it. They have a legal liability for that. And that just doesn't really exist in the online space. So that's why we said, while creating these safety standards in the social media platform, regulating news content in that way, is that the news industry already has its own codes. It already has clear accountability and liability. And therefore, it's right that any challenge to a newspaper, be it through a complaints body or through the courts, should take place as it normally does. And we shouldn't be looking to create a separate regulatory regime for the news industry, which has already got its own codes. And therefore, the benefit we'll see from the online safety bill will be seeking to create accountability and responsibility for this unregulated media, which exists. So I think that's why it's important, and it's a recognition that the, the free press is an important part of our democracy. We've never had the press regulated by a government regulator, and we shouldn't do that now. And the press, quality journalism should be free to be distributed. The journalists and the editors have the responsibility and liability for that, and it rests on them.
I think we're talking obviously about International Press Freedom Day, and we often think on a sort of global scale and think of those sort of despot regimes where press freedom isn't enjoyed by many. But clearly, press freedom is not just important internationally, it's important here in the UK, as we've touched on, in terms of those protections in different pieces of legislation, and the importance of not having statutory regulation of the press. But that is often framed in, I think, a lot of people's mind around kind of big news stories and national issues. But clearly, and it looks like you're in your car on the campaign trail for the local elections this week. The press has a hugely important role in reporting on what's happening at councils and at local authority level, and holding local power to account as well as national power. We at the NMA have a partnership with the BBC, the Local Democracy Reporting Scheme, which I think is a really great successful and demonstration of how the actions on kind of local reporting. You touched on how that's changed in your time in Parliament, but can you sort of reflect on why you feel local journalism is so important too?
Absolutely. I think you've touched on it there. It's the ability for people to be sitting in courtrooms, sitting in council meetings, developing networks of contacts, talking to organizations within a local community to understand what's going on. That's important, not only to give people a sense of what's happening in the place where they live, but also to provide challenge, to pose questions. And without that, I think the danger is that things that things that should be exposed, things that should be talked about aren't, and that people don't get the important news from their community that they have a right to know. And I think that's I think we see that clearly at a national level, but it applies locally as well, where a county or a city is being run. It's important that when people come to vote in local elections, they've got information they can rely on that tells them about that. If someone is doing something wrong, it's right that that is exposed and talked about. And without local media, you don't have the ability to do that. Or the danger is that without local media, what you have is the local conversation shaped by the people that control the largest social media groups. The people that can have got the largest forums, and the information within those forums might not be accurate or reliable. So, and I think local news, and this is where I think, going back to the Digital Markets Act and the idea of the news bargaining code, the idea that the major platforms have got to give compensation to news companies for their content. Where that could be most beneficial is with local reporting and local journalism. I mean, the reason these sort of democracy reporters are that the BBC fund are so important is that there's simply now often not enough people that can sit in those committee meetings and those public to take notes and to ask questions and to gather information that's important that people should know about. And we need local journalism to be properly compensated so that that can continue.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you know, we campaign on this all the time as the NMA because it is so important. And without the proper funding, it goes back to my earlier comment, without that funding and sustainability, you can't have people there doing the diligent work, reading through council papers and uncovering those local stories, which often then become, by their nature, a big national story because something that can be exposing a wrongdoing or misconduct at a local level has bigger implications. And it's like, the whole news ecosystem is fed from a local story because ultimately everything is local.
Absolutely right. And these things are important, and they can develop into bigger stories. And most things that are news, I mean, if you think of what's in a newspaper, what's there, a lot of it comes back to hard news, comes back to investigation. It comes back to someone having the time and the experience and the knowledge and the insight to be able to uncover something that is important, rather than it just being simply the reporting of what people are saying.
Super, brilliant. Damian, I'm going to wrap us up there so you can get back to that campaign trail. But thank you very much for joining us today. If you're watching and you want to follow Damian's work, to @Damian Collins or his website, damiancollins.com. I'm Owen Meredith, Chief Exec of the News Media Association, and you can follow me at Owen Meredith NMA or visit our website, newsmediauk.org, to find out more. Chamber UK connects councils to the Commons, and you can join the conversations by following Chamber on Twitter @Chamber Voice or on Instagram Chamber UK, and check out the website chamberuk.com.